So welcome again. Thank you very much for having this very short break. We still have two very interesting presentation before the discussion of this panel. And the next is Devlin Scofield. Devlin is an assistant professor of history at Northwest Missouri State University. He has published chapters in edited volumes with Manchester University Press in 2017, also at Berkham Books in 2018, and Routledge Press in 2019, so every year. He is currently working on a manuscript entitled The Vanquished Among Victors, Veterans and National Belonging in Alsace, 1871-1953, that examines Germany and France's treatment of former enemy soldiers in the Alsatian borderland. So, Devlin, the floor is yours, and thank you very much for coming, if even online.
Thank you for that introduction,
We
Éva.
cannot hear you.
You can't?
I try.
I can hear you.
Yes, now.
You can hear? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you for that kind introduction, and especially would like to echo Alexander's thanks for our conference organizers for giving me the opportunity to participate, but then also persevering and sticking through and making sure the conference still happened in this altered format. I'm looking forward to hearing everyone else's papers and appreciate you all being here. So a word on terminology before I begin. So throughout the paper, I'll reference Germans as well as old Alsatians, authentic Alsatians, true Alsatians, and just Alsatians in general. And I should say that that reflects French official labels that are given to these population groups. It, of course, doesn't reflect necessarily the self-understandings that these people had. So the title of my paper is Demarcating the National Family, French Nation Building and Citizenship Policy in Alsace following the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles reflected the aggressive nation building and population policies in Alsace following the First World War. Even before the treaty officially went into effect on January 1920, Republican officials commenced an effort to cleanse the former Reichsland the most egregious vestiges of imperial institutions. An essential component of this effort was an evaluation of the region's population and the separation of the nationally loyal from the nationally suspect. French authorities distinguished between the so-called authentic Alsatians and German immigrants, the latter being a pejorative term that designated undesirability. Officials delineated this distinction by mobilizing wartime definitions, identity cards, and triage commissions. In the process, they defined the parameters of the French nation and the Franco-German borderland. The officially endorsed Alsatian-German dichotomy left little room for national ambiguity and nuance. Many ethnic Germans and even old Alsatians whose actions contradicted the narrative of an abiding Francophile Alsace were identified as potentially disruptive to national reintegration and liable to be expulsed. This paper argues that in contrast to German policies following the Franco-Prussian War, eligibility to be included in the nation after World War I transformed from an agreement to accept the sovereignty of the new government and abide by its laws to a model that prioritized ethnocultural descent, previous nationality, and actions under the imperial administration. The Treaty of Versailles codified this more exclusive definition of national belonging, effectively privileging France's right to claim its ideal citizenry over the individual's right to choose their desired homeland. The net result was widespread voluntary and forced migration from Alsace, leaving a legacy of bitterness that would come back to haunt the borderland in 1940. Post-war French nationality practices in Alsace challenged existent citizenship legislation and demonstrated the limits of officials' confidence in the assimilatory power of Republican institutions. The paths to citizenship outlined in the Treaty of Versailles marked a distinct departure from assimilatory notions of jus soli codified in the 1889 French nationality law. This change reflected Republican authorities' fears that the undifferentiated naturalization of thousands of German immigrants and their descendants who'd migrated to the Reichsland during the imperial period would significantly problematize the reconciliation of Alsace to France. Republican confidence regarding Alsatians' national sentiment resided in their faith in the population's enduring French loyalty, not in the confidence of assimilation. Definitions of an authentic Alsatian became progressively exclusive from 1914 to 1920. This evolution reflected French authorities' most pressing contemporary concerns, as well as the context in which they were articulated. The wartime desire to add symbolic credence to France's claim to Alsace through the enlistment of Reichsländer in the French military fostered a slightly more inclusive understanding, while post-war designations promulgated in the context of military victory and occupation of Alsace encouraged a more constrained definition. Ultimately, the tension between existing citizenship legislation and the reality of the multicultural frontier led French officials to adopt policies that combined elements of jus soli and jus sanguini, along with considerations independent of both citizenship principles. Regardless of the supposed expansiveness of French citizenship law for migrants who crossed French borders, it proved exclusionary and restrictive when French borders moved across people. The First World War was a watershed in the history of Alsace. Although the vast majority of Reichsländer fought for Germany, thousands also donned the horizon blue and served France. The military service of Alsatians in Republican forces provided critical symbolic currency to the claim that Alsace and Lorraine had never ceased to be French and should be so again. However, engaging the borderland recruits necessitated delineating eligibility. Thus, military service emerged as one of the earliest forums in which French authorities articulated the definition of an authentic Alsace-Lorrainer. Lieutenant Colonel Albert Carr, tasked with screening potential enlistees, defined Alsace-Lorrainers as, quote, all individuals are Alsace-Lorrainers of French origin who themselves were French or who possess a paternal ascendant who was French on May 20th, 1871. Would have continued to be French if not for the intervention of the Treaty of Frankfurt. Every Alsace-Lorrainer of French origin is presumed to have French sentiments. This definition is important because it reveals a fundamental assumption of French citizenship policy in the lost provinces. The description reiterated that simply being born and raised in Alsace was insufficient to guarantee French loyalties. In contrast, the statement assumed that pro-French sentiment survived among true Alsatians and was transferred across paternal generations. Its use for determining Alsatians and Lorrainers' French military eligibility denotes genuine official investment in this definition and the linked belief that this innate Francophilia was stronger than nearly 50 years of German education, military service, and economic integration. In truth, German immigrants and their descendants living in Alsace posed a significant conundrum for the existing French citizenship policy. The records of the Conference d'Alsace-Lorraine, which was charged with advising the government on matters relating to the reunification of Alsace-Lorraine with France, provide another important window on the French vision of an Alsace and Lorraine reattached to the patrie. Distinguishing between native and foreign population elements in a fashion that mirrored French military policy, participants agreed that Germans residing in Alsace should not automatically acquire French citizenship, but that they should be given the option to be naturalized. Some delegates, though, expressed doubt in the acculturating power of the French state by suggesting that German immigrants were unassimilable because of their extreme foreignness. Despite their worries, the comprehensive expulsion of all Germans was never seriously discussed. Members viewed such actions as, quote, inhumane and beneath the dignity of France, end quote. In the end, the conference adopted the recommendation that Germans who lived in Alsace before August 2nd, 1914, could apply for French citizenship after a 3-year waiting period. This delay was to be reduced for Germans married to an Alsatian to a year. French armies occupied Alsace behind evacuating German forces in November 1918. Although the Reichsland theoretically remained part of Germany, Republican officials moved quickly to reassert French sovereignty. An integral component of this effort was to limit the influence and presence of Germans in Alsace. To this end, French officials adopted a 4-tiered, alphabetically designated identification system that divided the borderland populations into categories of A, E, C, or D. I have my translation of the official descriptions of this card eligibility on this slide. The residents designated as A card holders had either themselves possessed French citizenship before May 10, 1871, or were descendants of such individuals. B cards indicated that the bearer had 2 forebearers who were not of pure Alsatian stock. Non-German foreigners were C card holders. D cards designated residents who themselves or their forebearers originated from a country that had been a wartime enemy of France. Not surprisingly, most of these were ethnic Germans. Now, in this next slide, I actually have an example of an A and a D card. Now, what's on the left on my computer screen, this A card, its most prominent feature, of course, is that tricolor slash across its cover, which from the perspective of French authorities reflected the bearer's impeccable French credentials. In the spirit of highlighting continuities with wartime practices, the A card, I would argue, evolves out of a wartime pass known as the tricolor card, which was given to Alsatians and Lorrainers who were in France during hostilities and likewise had proved their impeccable French credentials. And bearing this card was important because it gave the bearer the same rights as any other French citizen in terms of access to state aid and freedom of movement. Now, the card on what's my right, this D card, is issued to an individual who resided in Strasbourg but was born in Germany, and as such was identified as an ethnic German by French authorities. So the conferral of these identity cards did not concurrently award French nationality, but the particular card that a resident received did reveal their official ethnic classification, and so disclosed their particular avenue to French citizenship after the Treaty of Versailles ratification. Identity card assignments to the population of the Franco borderland broke down as follows. Out of a total population of about 1.9 million, 59% received A cards, 10% collected B cards, 3% C cards, and 28% were given D cards. So you can get a sense of what from the official French perspective, that ethnic breakdown of the population was. Now, in the period between the arrival of occupying French forces in November 1918 and October 1919, when the French Chamber ratified the Treaty of Versailles, the cards became a vehicle for identification and discrimination. And individuals' categorization determined their freedom of movement, ability to change money, vote, and potential job prospects in French Alsace. The transitory period in sovereignty between December 1918 and January 1920 was marked by widespread voluntary and forced migration from Alsace. The expulsions were an essential component of the French campaign to remove population elements judged to be irreconcilable to France. Germans made up the largest contingent of expellees. The forced migrations marked a dramatic break with post-Franco-Prussian War population policies. The element of choice and propriety protection was eliminated for many expellees. In some cases, targeted individuals were given only 24 hours notice to pack 30 to 40 kilograms of luggage at a maximum 2,000 marks per adult and 500 marks per child before reporting to French authorities at a border crossing. The nightmare of expellees' emigration was amplified by the traumatic nature of their expulsion. Republican officials were not content to allow exercised individuals to quietly slip over the border. The Committee of Exiled Alsace-Lorrainers accused the French of deliberately exposing expellees to the physical and oral abuse of an Alsatian mob on the day of their departure by deliberately assembling them in Strasbourg's busiest square. Now, the chaotic nature of the post-war period and inexact record keeping makes any attempts to count the number of immigrants who left the region an estimation at best. Historians and contemporary sources have generally agreed upon a figure that ranges from 110 to 114,000. Sampling of reports that I found covering the latter half of 1919 details that 96,600 residents had exited Alsace by the time the Treaty of Versailles went into effect. Beyond the immediate human and financial costs, the expulsions of the German population set a disastrous precedent for the victor in the borderland. Triage commissions were another important component of negative French population policies. These panels were tasked with identifying nationally suspect individuals among the native Alsace-Lorrainer population. As historian Laird Boswell has pointed out, triage in the 1914-18 war was associated with the sorting of the wounded at French field hospitals, between those who could be treated and those who could be saved. The use of the word in the post-war context of the former Reichsland implied a sorting of the population between, quote, those deemed fit to belong to the national community and those who were not. And that's Boswell's words. French Premier Georges Clemenceau established the commissions on November 2nd, 1918. They were charged with examining and making sentencing recommendations in cases of Alsatians accused of acting, quote, contrary to the sentiments of the population, end quote. Thus, the myth of an ever-loyal Alsace continued to shape post-war French policymaking by distinguishing the allegedly exceptional individual from the otherwise collectively held national loyalties of the region. Director General Paul Valois related that he defined these suspect individuals as, quote, people who before November 11th, 1918, expressed pro-German sentiment or participated in anti-French demonstrations, those who had denounced others for pro-French sentiment, those who'd lent their aid before or during the war to our enemies in an objectionable manner, those who were deported in 1914 and by reason of the Berne Accord were returned home and used this opportunity to advise the Germans about affairs in France and the enlistment of their fellow Alsace-Lorrainer citizens in the French army, and those that accepted rank in the German army under conditions which could make their loyalism suspect. Thus, Alsatians perceived to have transgressed against the French nation and its aspirant citizenry during the 1914-18 conflict were prominent targets. Critics pointed out that all of these alleged offenses could be interpreted as acts of loyalty in support of the state that held sovereignty over the Reichsland at the time. University of Strasbourg professor Robert Redslob argued that Alsatians and Lorrainers were internationally recognized as German subjects before the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, making any French distinction between national and anti-national actions prior to that date legally indefensible. Historians have identified additional targets of the triage commissions, including German labor leaders, former civil servants and state employees, suspected prostitutes, and cultural mediators, such as teachers, religious leaders, and regionalists. The ambiguity of the nationally suspect category allowed French authorities to target and remove any individual perceived to represent an overt or latent threat for the new regime. Triage commissions recommended sentences that could range from surveillance in Alsace to detention in the interior of France or expulsion to Germany. Time constraints encouraged decisive action. The military occupation of the Reichsland empowered French authorities to expel nationally suspect individuals in the name of security and necessity that would be absent once the borderland was formally reincorporated into France. The Treaty of Versailles codified pre-existing national definitions and population policies in Alsace. The entirety of the annex following the Alsace-Lorraine section was devoted to demarcating national categories and outlining various routes to French citizenship for the residents of the former Reichsland. In contrast to the policies utilized by imperial authorities after the Franco-Prussian War, citizenship in 1918 moved from a primarily performative model to one that emphasized the importance of descent. Ethnocultural considerations, previous citizenship, and place of residence took their place alongside the obligation to accept the sovereignty of the new government and abide by its laws. Another critical difference between the Franco-Prussian and First World War peace settlements was the voluntariness of the post-war nationality choice. In 1871, the residents of the annexed areas were free to choose whether they wished to remain French or become German. Regardless of their decision, the persons and property of the individual opt-in were guaranteed. Emigration and the establishment of permanent residency in France were the only requirements for borderland residents that chose French citizenship. The Treaty of Versailles did not make provisions for nationality options. People who originated from Alsace, whom the French judged to be old Alsatians, automatically became French citizens. There existed no provision to decline their reintegration. Just as Alsatians did not have a say in whether or not they received French citizenship on January 10, 1920. In certain cases, France also claimed the exclusive right to approve the release of Alsatians from their French citizenship. Article 53 explicitly forbid the German government from asserting their nationality over any resident of the former Reichsland claimed by Republican officials. Residents of the borderland identified as native had their French nationality automatically reinstated, and that's what I'm talking about is right directly behind my head. Individuals falling into this category were either, quote, persons who lost their French nationality by the application of the Franco-German Treaty of May 10, 1871, and who have not since that date acquired any nationality other than German, end quote. Or the direct descendant of such a person, provided that their paternal line did not include a German that had migrated to the province after July 15, 1870. Both clauses demonstrate the continued investment in the nationalist image of Alsace. Republican officials were convinced that any Alsatian who had experienced life within France would unequivocally cling to that memory and loyalty through 47 years of German rule. The involuntary bestowal of French citizenship on the descendants of this pre-1870 population is premised upon a similar assumption, that French male citizens would have inevitably passed the love for France on to their children and grandchildren, perhaps through blood, but certainly through upbringing. Individuals in these two groups were the only undisputed authentic Alsatians from the official perspective, and had a right to be awarded French citizenship. This position was confirmed by the French Court of Appeals in 1927, when it ruled that only residents of the provinces that had reclaimed their French nationality by right qualified as Alsatians and Lorrainers of French origin. A single male forebearer was sufficient to taint the entire national pedagogical enterprise and force such individuals to apply for naturalization. Section 2 of the Treaty of Versailles Annex identified an array of borderland residents eligible to apply for naturalization within a year of the treaty going into effect on January 10, 1920. These groups included, but were not limited to, individuals who possessed at least one ancestor who lost their French citizenship as a result of the Treaty of Frankfurt, old Germans who'd been domiciled in Alsace before July 15, 1870, and the spouse of an Alsatian who had automatically reclaimed their French citizenship. Military service in the French or Allied army during the 1914 to 1918 conflict and marriage were the only routes that allowed an old German to receive French citizenship within the space of a year. Unlike those Alsatians and Lorrainers who automatically received their new nationality, the naturalization claimants were required to declare before the local mayor their desire to become French. This act commenced a month-long waiting period in which any Frenchman could intervene and oppose the petition. If no objection was forthcoming, the applicant's demand would be successful. Section 3 of the Annex addressed Germans who'd immigrated to Alsace between July 15, 1870 and August 3, 1914, and their descendants. The treaty expressly forbid any old German from automatically receiving French citizenship. Such individuals were made eligible for naturalization if they lived in the Reichsland before August 3, 1914, and lived for an unbroken period of 3 years in the provinces after November 11, 1918. So you can see the connection here between the wartime deliberations from the Conference d'Alsace-Lorraine. Ultimately, the post-war order created by the Treaty of Versailles failed to facilitate the reconciliation of Alsace to France. The identification cards, triage commissions, and expulsions disillusioned many of even the old Alsatian population and made them fundamentally question their assumptions about France. The distinction between old Alsatians and Germans in 1918 and 1919 marked the first official program that screened and judged the desirability of the province's population based on descent by signifying that national loyalty was at one level transferable through blood kinship. Thus, it was the French who introduced an exclusionary model of citizenship into the Franco-German borderland. These definitions continued to shape Republican policy in the interwar period. In the late 1930s, French officials responded to a controversy regarding the withholding of combatants cards and the associated financial support to certain First World War veterans living in Alsace and Lorraine by assuring the concerned parties that the affected individuals were not Alsatians and Lorrainers, but rather, quote, former Germans descended from German parents, end quote, who've taken advantage of Section 3 of the Treaty of Versailles, have been naturalized following the 3-year waiting period. Thus, from the Republican perspective, a German in 1918 was still a German in 1939, even after they'd possessed French citizenship for nearly 2 decades. Equally problematic was the precedent set by French actions in Alsace after 1918 that returned with a vengeance in 1940. National Socialist administrators transformed the parameters of belonging and introduced a previously unexperienced level of coercion and violence to the reordering of the borderlands population. A striking element of the transition between French and German sovereignty in 1940 is the degree to which the Nazis consciously emulated previous French policies and deliberately, even mockingly, invoked Republican models to justify their actions in the Franco-German borderland. Thank you.
Thank you, Devlin. It was for me really shocking following the similarities and the differences between the French as a case and the Central European cases I know better. So thank you again. I wish we can discuss it later in depth. But now we will leave the French peripheries and we'll move to Bukovina. Our last presenter is Cristina Florea. Cristina is an assistant professor of modern European history at Cornell University, and she is currently writing a book about the Eastern European borderland, Bukovina, a study of provincial life at the frontiers of empires over the course of almost 2 centuries, in which Bukovina underwent several regime changes and revolutions. Cristina, nice to see you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Eva, and everybody else for putting together this conference. I must confess I would rather be in Vienna, but if this was not possible, this is good enough too. So thank you very, very much. So I think I'm going to start by sharing my screen, see if this works, and then hopefully you can see this. Okay. Sorry?
It's up, excellent, it's fine.
Okay, perfect. So as we all know, right, one of the key words or main operative words at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 was national self-determination. And President Woodrow Wilson, whose whole program for restructuring the international system around the idea of a just sovereignty, profoundly transformed the post-war world and defined national self-determination as, quote, government by consent. So Wilsonianism became the ideological foundation for a new international system, the details of which the great powers worked out in Paris. And so the conference marked, as historian Eric Weitz, for example, once wrote, a shift from a system of international politics based on territory and sovereign rulers to one defined by population politics, and where sovereignty was rooted in national homogeneity. So, and what follows here, I would like to show that while this was generally the case, older notions of territoriality didn't really suddenly go away in 1919, but continued to complicate Wilsonian attempts to redefine sovereignty around population. Older ideas about territory not only survived, but were actually repurposed through the language of national self-determination. This was certainly the case in Bukovina, which is the topic of my talk today, a province of the Habsburg Empire that ended up being incorporated into Greater Romania in 1918. Now, Bukovina in many ways did not fit this model of a new world order in which territorial and national boundaries were supposed to coincide. And this was no secret. Bukovinans knew it, the Romanian government that laid claim to Bukovina knew it, and the great powers in Paris knew it too. As we all know, right, members of the Supreme Council came to Paris armed with teams of experts and academics who were charged with mapping these regions whose fates were to be decided there. And one particular official handbook that was produced by the British Foreign Office on Bukovina noted, for example, that, quote, Bukovina lies on the great highway of migration from east to west and is consequently inhabited by a strange mixture of races, even at the present day. According to the latest census, which had been carried out under Austrian rule in 1910, Romanians, for example, made up 34% of Bukovina's population, while Ruthenians or Ukrainians made up 38%. German speakers, which was a group that also included Jews, apparently formed 21% of the province's population. And the handbook also noted that, quote, German is still the language of culture and the official tongue in Bukovina. And interestingly, also that 1/3 of the population residing in the province's capital, Czernowitz, was actually Jewish. Territories like this made it very clear to the arbiters of the post-war international system that the lands and peoples of the former Habsburg monarchy might have to be further unmixed to prevent ethnic conflict. As historian Larry Wolff put it in a recent book on Woodrow Wilson's role in the remaking of Eastern Europe, the great powers believed they had to intervene surgically to reconstruct those pieces through further amputation. But even so, the successor states ended up incorporating highly diverse territories that defied this principle of ethnic homogeneity in every possible way. Even if it meant that its population was now almost 1/3 non-Romanian, the Greater Romanian state didn't shy away from taking advantage of this unprecedented international conjuncture to expand. And Woodrow Wilson himself confessed that, quote, he was outraged at the rapacity of Romania. Its appetite for territory seemed to him unquenchable, as the Romanian delegation at Paris insisted on seizing not only the territories they had been promised in 1916 in return for joining the war on the Entente side, but even more. But by incorporating ethnically mixed provinces like Bukovina, the Romanian nation state came to resemble almost like a mini empire in its own right. Bukovina owed this extraordinary ethnic heterogeneity in large part to its imperial past, of course. Like the neighboring province of Galicia, Bukovina was a Habsburg invention. It became a self-standing entity only in 1774, 1775. when Habsburg troops annexed the northwestern corner of the Principality of Moldavia, which was then under Ottoman suzerainty. This happened at the end of a Russo-Turkish war in which Austria had served as a mediator. Initially, Bukovina was placed directly under military administration, but later was incorporated into Galicia as an administrative subdivision of it. It gained autonomy briefly in 1848 and then definitively in 1860 when it actually received the title of duchy or hercogtum and also was allowed to have a provincial parliament of its own. Now, under Habsburg rule, Bukovina underwent massive demographic transformations. The early Josephine administration there perceived the province to be underpopulated, underdeveloped, and so they encouraged a series of colonization projects, privileging above all colonists from the German lands who were supposed to help remediate all these problems by settling here. Bukovina's population also fluctuated because of population shifts. For instance, in the first few years after the Habsburg takeover, a number of Moldavians crossed the border into Moldavia, whereas under the Galician administration, a large Ruthenian and Jewish population also settled into the province to take advantage of various privileges they had there, such as lower taxation rates or exemptions from military service. So as a result, by the turn of the 20th century, Bukovina was one of Austria's most diverse territories, and many contemporaries actually likened it to a Habsburg Empire in miniature, because no single ethnic group predominated there. World War I made it even more difficult to know who Bukovina exactly belonged to, especially according to this new Wilsonian model of sovereignty. Many Jews from Bukovina, for example, had fled during the war to Vienna or to the empire's western borderlands. Romanians and Ruthenians who were suspected of treason or espionage on behalf of the Entente had been arrested and deported to internment camps. So by the fall of 1918, the Austrian administration had returned to Czernowitz, to Bukovina's capital, but many Bukovinan refugees were still not back yet, and soldiers from this region were just beginning to return from the front. So Bukovina's residents, whoever was still there, were taken completely by surprise when Emperor Karl issued his manifesto to the emperor's nationalities on October 16, 1918, shortly after Bukovina had been liberated from its third Russian occupation. Only a few months before, Karl had actually come on an official visit to Czernowitz, and here you see a picture taken from during that visit, which gave locals the impression that life here would just resume its usual course. Bukovinas didn't really know that earlier that year, Emperor Karl had promised northern Bukovina to Ukraine during the Brest-Litovsk negotiations in exchange for grain, nor did they know that the emperor had also begun secret negotiations for a separate peace with the Entente. Soon after this manifesto was published, as we know, a whole plethora of national councils emerged across Austria-Hungary, each one proclaiming their right to self-determine. The Czechoslovak National Council, for example, issued a declaration of independence already on October 18, which led President Wilson to revise his 14 points from recognizing the right to autonomous development for all peoples of Austria-Hungary to actually urging nationalities to decide on their own conception of their rights, quote, and destiny as members of the family of nations. This was really a fateful change from his earlier position towards Austria-Hungary, which he had always regarded up to that point as a permanent actor on the international stage. But others responded differently to the manifesto. And especially as order broke down and Vienna's ties to the provinces began disintegrating, a variety of visions of national self-determination developed everywhere across the empire in parallel, sometimes with very little in common. In Bukovina, for example, a rift emerged between nationalist politicians who argued that the province should be divided into two ethnically distinct parts, with Ukrainians claiming the northern half and Romanians taking the south, and those who insisted that the province's territorial integrity be maintained at all costs. As we'll see, thanks to a convergence of perspectives that were motivated actually by very different interests, it was this latter vision that would prevail. The first to mobilize in Bukovina were the Ukrainians. They formed a national council, or Rada as they call it, which was actually a subsidiary to the Ukrainian National Council formed in Lemberg or Lviv in Galicia. In Bukovina, this council was headed by a renowned and very esteemed local Ukrainian politician, Omelian Popovich. The Rada disposed of military forces of their own, which consisted mostly of Habsburg soldiers, riflemen, and volunteer units who were returning from the front as the Austro-Hungarian army began disintegrating. These units were pretty chaotic, but they played a really important role in beginning to claim territories for the new West Ukrainian Republic that this council proclaimed in Lviv. On October 19, a Ukrainian Constituent Assembly convened in Lemberg and declared the independence of the West Ukrainian National Republic, which was formed of a large part of Galicia and also claimed Ukrainian parts of Bukovina. In Bukovina, the local Ukrainian National Council formally recognized the Lviv Rada's authority on November 3rd, but even so, the province was not yet in Ukrainian hands firmly, because as the situation began deteriorating in Galicia, where Poles challenged Ukrainian claims to the province and vice versa, the Ukrainian legions that were stationed in Bukovina had to depart for the north to offer military reinforcements. So the Ukrainian National Council was basically left without any kind of substantial military support and had no way to hold on to its territorial claims. To make matters even more complicated, the Austrian governor, who was still in Czernowitz at that time, Graf von Etzdorf, refused to hand over the province's administration to the Ukrainians on the grounds that it was unclear who exactly should be granted sovereignty over Bukovina. Also, he had not received any clear instructions from Vienna. The problem was that in parallel with the Ukrainians, Romanians had also mobilized to lay claim to Bukovina. On October 28, a Romanian National Council showed up at the governor's door, demanding that he transfer power to them. The day before, they had come together in Czernowitz and voted to unite Bukovina in its entirety with all other Romanian lands in a national independent state. The head of this Romanian National Council was an old Romanian politician from Bukovina named Iancu Flondor, a landowner, representative of a somewhat conservative strain of Romanian nationalism in the province. And he insisted that Romanians should not have to give up any part of Bukovina. Governor Etzdorf, who was very much true to the monarchy's commitment to granting all peoples equal collective rights, only agreed to hand over power to a joint delegation made of both Ukrainians and Romanians, and headed by these two national commissars, Omelian Popovich, who represented the Ukrainians, and Aurel Onciul, who was actually not part of the Romanian National Council, but proclaimed himself to be a representative of Romanians in the province. This delegation basically showed up right before the government with a memorandum and got him to hand over power to them on November 6th. They declared that they would maintain the status quo in Bukovina until the upcoming peace conference, but they also agreed that Bukovina would be divided into two distinct parts, one Romanian, the other Ukrainian, based on an Austrian imperial census from 1910, with Chernovitz a kind of neutral city in between. These clashing visions of sovereignty based on national self-determination had their roots in earlier attempts at territorial reform and restructuring that had happened already within the Habsburg Empire. So when they resurfaced in 1918, they were conditioned, so to speak, by an imperial imagination that continued to define what these local actors believed to be their options. The obsession with maintaining Bukovina's territorial integrity, for example, was a crucial aspect of early Romanian nationalism in Bukovina. Ever since its beginnings in the early 19th century, the Romanian movement had been intimately tied with the movement to obtain provincial autonomy. Nationalists in this generation, Flondor's generation, inherited this older tradition. And for them too, guaranteeing Bukovina's integrity and autonomy was still the main order of business. So was the idea of a partitioned Bukovina that the Ukrainian National Council now advocating. This too had precedence in the earlier 19th century. These two visions had first clashed in 1848, when in the wake of the 1848 revolution, Ukrainian national activists called for the province's partition and unification with Galicia. At that same time in 1848, Romanian elites in the province had fought to separate Bukovina from Galicia and to obtain provincial autonomy. And most recently, this tension between these two visions had manifested itself on the eve of World War I, when Ukrainian-Romanian conflict over the Eastern Orthodox Church in Bukovina had come to a boiling point. Traditionally, the Orthodox Church there under Austrian rule had been a supranational institution meant to serve both the entirety of the Orthodox population, consisting of both Ukrainians and Romanians. Romanians, however, saw the church as a historically Romanian institution and expected to continue playing a dominant role in church leadership. So when the Austrian administration extended equal rights to Ukrainians within the church, Romanian elites perceived this as an unwarranted imposition on the empire's part. By the 1890s, Ruthenian activists were complaining that Romanians resisted the fundamental laws and that they continued to dominate the church, and demanded increasingly that the church be separated into two halves, one Ruthenian, the other Romanian, one concentrated in the north, the other one in the south. Of course, Romanian elites resisted, and in 1913, when the Austrian authorities actually appointed the Ukrainian to a key role or key position within the church administration, they put up a fight. So one can imagine that local actors saw 1918 as yet another moment in this longer trajectory. Even though it seemed that in some ways this model of an ethnically divided Bukovina maybe would have been predestined to succeed, given that it had resurfaced over and over again, it did not prevail in 1918 because nationalists like Flondor were adamant that no part of Bukovina should be handed over to Ukrainians. And so crucially, Flondor actually appealed to the Romanian nation state to intervene militarily in Bukovina. Interestingly, around the same time, Onciu, who still had this agreement with the Ukrainians and believed that Bukovina should indeed be split, actually hurried to Iași, a city in the neighboring Romanian nation state, to intervene with the Romanian government and prevent a Romanian military intervention. But on arriving, he actually was arrested and interned, and kind of branded as a national traitor for insisting that Bukovina should remain a part of Austria. He was released only after People like Flondor intervened on his behalf multiple times, but even so, he was still banned from ever returning to Bukovina. So he, in fact, ended up dying far away from his homeland in Bucharest, where he never really felt at home in 1921. So once they were no longer hindered by the Ukrainian troops or by people like Onchu, the Romanian troops crossed the border into Bukovina on November 11, proclaiming that, quote, the Romanian army comes to you with amity and brings you assistance to freely realize your aspirations born out of the sacred right of peoples to determine themselves. The Romanian government saw Bukovina as a kind of a site of an existential battle between Latin and Slavic civilizations, a place where Romanians were supposedly in danger of becoming extinct, of falling prey to the influence of the Slavic population that had been supposedly encouraged to expand at their expense by the Austrian administration. This view was, by the way, propagated among others by a Romanian nationalist historian from Bukovina named Ion Nistor, who really kind of put forward this thesis of an impending Slavicization of Romanians in Bukovina during the war. So by the time the great powers convened in Paris to arbitrate the borders of Greater Romania, Bukovina already had a minister, in fact, representing it in the Romanian government in Bucharest. On November 28, 1918, the Romanian National Council, led by Flondor, had convoked a General Congress where representatives of all of Bukovina's nationalities dutifully voted for Bukovina to be definitively and unconditionally unified with Romania. I must note, though, that Ukrainians boycotted the Congress and Jews remained neutral. So in this case, too, as another historian, Leonard Smith, put it, the great powers ratified decisions that were effectively made elsewhere. This didn't really endear the Romanians to the great powers in Paris, where Romania was still seen as a kind of parvenu, because it had joined the war effort pretty late and had also come under Central Powers occupation. And to make matters worse, the personality of the head of the Romanian delegation, Prime Minister Ionice Brătianu, was also pretty problematic. As the Romanian Queen Marie described him, he was a tiresome, sticky, and tedious individual who really drew the ire of pretty much everyone who dealt with him at the conference because he insisted so much on these very maximalist territorial claims. Even the British Prime Minister, Lloyd George, cursed him under his breath, saying, "This damned fellow, he cannot even get coats for his soldiers without us," right? Yet he has the temerity to make all these territorial claims. The alternative for the great powers was much worse, however. If Romania did not lay claim to Bukovina, then it would have been revolutionary Ukraine, or even worse, Bolshevik Russia. So within a few months, to conclude, Bukovina ended up changing places in the imaginations of local and international actors who set to reconfigure this territory in the light of this principle of national self-determination. But remarkably, the province survived this process largely unscathed. Its former imperial configuration was preserved almost intact, because nationalists who pushed for self-determination and autonomy under imperial rule now favored partition and opposed Bukovina's unification with Romania. But those who were most eager to join Romania, on the other hand, opposed any kind of territorial division. So, even though they were very eager to extract Bukovina from this moribund empire, they ended up unwittingly preserving the province's imperial configuration and keeping its former borders intact. So in this way, they involuntarily ensured that Bukovina continued to defy all the principles on which this new Wilsonian international system was supposed to be based. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Cristina. You just mentioned some very, very important analytic points which we can maybe discuss in the context of the whole panel. But now I also want to invite Raul as a discussion partner because he is in the neighboring room and where is here? Okay. Yeah. And oh, no, sorry. Where is Raul? Wow. Sorry. No, sorry, it was my mistake, but I will find Raul. So
he's already there. I just added him.
okay, great. Thank you, Sandro. And Gabor is here. So we made a lot of notices, I guess, and now we try to make some concluding remarks and starting questions for discussions. And for me, one of the most interesting questions is this demographic engineering, which you can observe in all of the case studies and regional studies as well. So I just wonder why it became so a kind of European norm to re-establish territorial integrities or national integrities on the basis of demographic engineering, expulsion, etc. And the second one, I have many others, but I wonder why the form of national council could play such a formative role. It was not important whether it was a Jewish one or a Ukrainian one, or a Hungarian one, a religious one or a not religious one. So why a national council as an institutional form could play such a formative role in these very, very moving years in the last years of the First World War. And so these two questions I would like to put into discussion, and Gabor, you can also continue if you want.
Thank you very much for all the papers. I see a lot of threads running through the presentations, and I will also limit myself to issues. One is broader and just something that came to my mind listening to Rupiat Rebat, and the other is something that is there, that was there in the paper. And this is a citizenship and its experience, but also what kind of role, as it was mentioned by Alexander Langstab, these welfare institutions played, however nascent they were during the war, that it made possible for states to make this selection. Also, probably to a certain extent, invited them to do it because of the extension of the state, as you also mentioned. And what kind of experience it could have been for those people who also fall in these categories, and for whom not the war, neither some kind of status of refugee or taking refuge from the war, or the engineering was the reason they were living on the territory, but something that was considered quite normal before the war. Migration in a more or less open space for many reasons, mostly for work reasons or establishing a family. So I'm interested in these nuances of the changes in the practice of the citizenship and how it also helped the states to use citizenship differently as it was used before. And the second one is it's really a broad issue, and I think that we will think of it throughout the whole conference. But listening to Zsófia's presentation, an analogy came to my mind, and this is the mandate system. Recently, Susan Pedersen argued that while the mandate system was earlier considered to be a failure, if we look at how it transformed how the states were compelled to speak of their colonial subjects, treat them because of the publicity the mandate system and the fate of these former colonial territories infused all of the politics around it. It was not exactly the failure it was considered earlier, but it shaped significantly how the decolonization process after the Second World War played out. And I was wondering whether we can find something similar argument regarding the minority treaty, which is now considered, as Raoul mentioned, as a complete failure. And usually the literature is arguing that the non-existence of singular minority protection system within the United Nations system is kind of admittance of it as well. But I just want to provoke everyone to think about this issue from this direction, from this perspective.
So then let's start with this round, and then Raoul, you can also take another round, and Christian Kadner also has a beautiful question. So just pick up one of the questions or comments, and please start to reply or discuss it. Who wants to start?
I just get the ball rolling very quickly. In response to Raoul's first question, broad question about citizenship, there are two pieces to this, a huge question, very interesting question, which we could spend all day talking about. The first is the impact of the war. And I think there's a long durée, even before the war, about citizenship circa 1920. I mentioned the work of Daniela Cagliotti, which I find particularly good on how citizenship evolved because of the war economy and because of anti-alienism during the war, to shape what nation-state post-imperial citizenship meant, including for labor. That's a very, very short answer, but I'm sure other people will have things to say. And your second question about the colonial dimension is very interesting. Devlin's presentation, for example, on the Alsace dynamics there. I keep coming back to a fantastic footnote in Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, where she says that the similarities between minority and colonial exploitation in 1920s Central Europe remain an extremely important but underexplored area. And I think half a decade later, it still remains an underexplored area. The parallels between colonial and minority exploitation. This also came out in Sofia's presentation a little bit on Poland. I also just want to mention, Olga in the chat had a question about the fate of Dr. Bianca Steinhardt, and through Lucien Wolf's intervention through the ILO and the ICJ, pressure was put on the Austrian government as part of a broader effort in 1922. And she did secure Austrian citizenship. There's obviously a longer story about people who didn't, but thank you for your question, Olga.
Who will be the next from the presenters?
Yeah, I can jump in, and if this is okay for you, and make a few remarks, and then later on I can comment on other things as well. I think your question about the Nationalrat or is a very good one, but it shows, at least it doesn't matter if it's a Jewish nationality, if it's a Czech one or whatever. But I think it's a kind of, it was a tool for the different groups to present themselves in a democratic way, or to play out their new rule, or how they could shape not only their own organization, or their small individual organization, but also the bigger ones in a democratic way, in opposite to the imperial ways, the Kaiser in Austria and the other imperial states. And at the same time, to show, okay, people are voting for us, people gave us the power, we can declare what we want, and we can play out and we can present our new position. So let's say for Jews in Austria, they didn't have the status of a nation, they didn't have of an ethnic group, so they could play out, okay, as a nation, we need such an institution. So you need a council, you need something, a national council to present, to say, okay, we are a national, a nation, and as a nation, we talk to not only the other nations, but the other players in the new play, in the new order. And citizenship is and not only to have citizenship, but where to live with your citizenship. That's a very interesting thing as well. So concerning Austria, you see, at least when you couldn't see it when you go through the files from the early 1920s, but if you look especially after the Anschluss, if you look at families, Jewish families who were living in Vienna, they were born, so the women and the men I'm talking about, they were born in Vienna, and suddenly they figured out in their young adulthood, whatever, or even, okay, we were living in Austria, we never could vote because we weren't Austrians. They figured out, okay, we have a kind of Heimatberechtigung in the Czech lands, maybe in Poland, maybe somewhere else. So then they tried to figure out to get one citizenship or the other to escape. But for the whole process of the 1920s and 30s, the families were living in Vienna. They had their businesses, they had their family lives, their relatives, but they weren't Austrians. And so they couldn't participate in the democratic way of life in Austria. And even later, if you go until the 80s and 90s, when people tried to get Austrian citizenship in Israel. So I know several cases where the Austrian consulate declared, well, your father was Polish, or even if you were born in Austria and you lived your whole life in Austria and whatever you did, so we can't help you. You have to turn to somebody else, to the Polish government or consulate. So the situation, what happened after World War I, so it's important, or it had influence on lives until nowadays.
Thank you very much. Just a very short question to Cristina. Cristina, could you agree with the definition of National Council, or the meaning of National Council being a kind of democratic institution after an imperial institutional background, but on the other hand, a very, very new form or new institution for ethnic belonging or nationalism or national politics?
Right. I'm glad you asked me because as Dita was talking, I kept making notes here. I was thinking about my case. I think it certainly wanted to present itself as a democratic institution, which is why they insist so much on having elections and people agreeing, right, with unification and so on. But one thing that I found very interesting is that multiple, or at the beginning of the formation of these national councils, there are multiple ideas about who belongs there as a legitimate representative of these nations. So in the case that I'm most familiar with, initially the National Council is just a group of representatives of Romanians who are already in the parliament in Vienna, and then find themselves there at the end of the war and basically have to adopt a formal position. And soon enough, they actually become disconnected from the other people in the provinces who mobilize by themselves and then create their own council, which has actually a different idea about what should be done. So that was one of the things that was most interesting to me, that it's not like a very clear or immediate path, right, in which we see, oh, this nation mobilizes into one council and has one vision of what should happen. And even with individuals like Onchu, you see people who think that they have the right to speak on behalf of a nationality now and make decisions are left out of this particular institution that becomes influential. And so they just end up kind of falling through the cracks. That's one thing. Let me see, what else did I want? Oh, about the argument about demographic engineering and so on. Here again, I mean, we talk so much about exclusion, which is definitely a key part. But there's also this other weird component, which is that not everybody is excluded in the same way. Others are deemed to be reformable. And that's what I found so interesting about the case of Ukrainians in Bukovina, because they share the Orthodox religion. There are these theories that nationalists spin out that actually they're long lost Romanians who forgot, right? And so they can be, if only they're reminded or they're returned where they belong, they can be made Romanian again. And so Jews, for example, don't have that option, but Ukrainians do. And so it's interesting that there's both a kind of inclusionary aspect to this and an exclusionary one. I think I'll just say that for now. But
thank you. Definitely, you have a question in the chat box. I don't know whether you could read it.
Yeah, thank you for the interesting comments and for this question. I'll address that question in a moment. I couldn't quite catch everything you were asking about citizenship, but one of the things I think is really striking is how war, I think, ultimately provides the context in which we see the collision between the rhetoric of the state and practice, where ultimately the real test of the state's confidence or insecurities in regards to its citizenry is really evident. And I study mostly Alsatian veterans, and during World War I, you see, despite all the rhetoric of the imperial state talking about how Alsatians are now good Germans, that in practice they're treated as nationally suspect and purposefully shipped to the Eastern Front to fight against the Russians, and then the French have their response to that as well. But as far as the question in the chat, so I sort of touch on this, but it's not the focus of my research. But there's a couple of interesting books, one by John Craig, which focuses specifically on the university in Strasbourg and this question, and Stephen Harp's book, Learning to be Loyal, which focuses on education. And one of the reading through these triage trials transcripts, which are only partially there, you see that teachers and professors in particular, if there's any sort of hint that they might be overly Germanophile, and I think the assumption of French authorities is that they naturally are, then they're pretty much some of the first to be pushed out initially. But I think what is really interesting and what connects more to my work is the sort of narratives that evolve that try to explain particular national loyalties. In my case, for the French, as they're trying to explain why the vast majority of Alsatians ultimately are fighting for Germany during World War I. There's this narrative of Frenchmen in field gray with tricolor hearts, and there's a lot of imagery of young Alsatians with little tricolor rosettes over their heart under their German uniform. So I think that's particularly interesting, and hopefully responds to your question a little bit there.
Thank you so much. We don't have many time to discuss, but I just want to give the word to Alexander Kohl, and I think maybe Raul will also comment this panel. We have a more general comment in the chat box. I don't know whether we can touch upon it now, but maybe we can go back to this fundamental question of theoretical frameworks of your case studies in this third day, because I think it's a huge question, and I don't know whether we can discuss it in 10 minutes or 5 minutes, what we already have. So Alex, and then maybe Raul.
Thanks, Eva. I'll try to be very quick. I have a quick question and a comment. So my question is again for Cristina, one more factual. You mentioned Popovich, and is that the same Popovich who then became mayor of Czernivtsi in 1940, and who was a bit like notorious as a savior of Jews? I mean, I could have looked this up on Wikipedia in the meantime, but as we are at a conference, I thought I'd ask you directly. And a follow-up or a different question: how much was actually the fate of autonomy, of Ukrainian autonomy in Bukovina sealed by the fact that geopolitically the region was sort of cut off from Ukraine because of the success of the Poles in crushing the Ukrainian uprising, so to say. And thanks for your talk. And then I have an observation. I think that's maybe for the days to come, how important it will be for us to start comparing the Central Eastern European and the Western European cases. In other words, talks like the one from Devlin and the one from Cristina, the repatriation of the ethnic Germans, and how much is that actually something we can relate and we can really compare in all differences, of course. So that's my little remark here. Thanks to all. It was a great panel.
Thank you, Alex. Cristina?
Thank you, Alex, so much. Those are wonderful questions. The first one, that's a different Popovich. There's just so many of them. This one was a Ukrainian nationalist. The other one was just a Romanian mayor. But there's a lot of them, actually. I myself, a couple of days ago, had to draw a chart because there's a couple more in addition to these. And as for autonomy, when you asked about the Ukrainians here being sealed off or cut off from Ukraine, were you referring to the 1918 period? And then after, what happens later?
No, more like 1920, when things were getting more violent.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, basically, the idea of an independent Ukrainian state pretty soon becomes an impossibility because things just fall apart. The only time when the Ukrainians here come very close to thinking this is achievable is actually under joint German and Austro-Hungarian occupation when they're united with Galicia. But afterwards, it kind of fades away. But again, they do maintain those links with Ukrainians in Galicia, and it's there that the main center of irredentism and so on remains. So throughout the 1930s, there are all these things flowing in from Galicia, like manifestos and brochures and flags and things like that, that alarm the Romanian government. So it's still close enough to the center of Ukrainian nationalism that it has an influence on it. But it's absolutely true that, it goes very quickly from being like this tremendous possibility that nobody had imagined to don't even think about a separate Ukrainian state there. Thanks so much for the questions.
Okay, now it is 5:37. But Raul, you can make your comments and then.
Yeah, I realize that we're over time already, and I'm going to give up on the individual questions to our panelists. I just want to thank you all for some very interesting presentations. And the one thing that I found between the four presentations was the interplay between local actors and the overall context in which these local actors operated. And this is not necessarily something you have to answer right now. Of course, I will be happy if you did. But I'm wondering about the extent to which local actors reflected on these categories that were circulating at this time, on notions of self-determination, on ideas of citizenship, and how did they process them? How did they manage these notions on a local level? How were they articulated in local discourse, and what were also the sort of like the room for maneuver that they had given the overarching context? That, and yeah, just to follow up on Gabor's earlier comment, because it's something that's also of interest to me. What do we get if we read the minority treaties and the mandates together? That's something that I think is very much, I would say, needed, and something that can connect these colonial threads that we saw in Zsofia's presentation, that we saw in the parallels between the situation that Devlin was describing and the one that Cristina identified. And I think it's definitely an exercise worth doing, to read the minority treaties and the mandates together, and to try to see to determine the imperial sort of like, hierarchies present behind those two, and why some of them were applied to some spaces, others to others, and so on. And also that sort of makes minorities appear a bit more diverse than just a minority, as Cristina was just putting it. Some groups were salvageable, they were redeemable, others were not. Not all minorities were equal, even though the sort of like legally the framework said they would be. I guess those are my comments on the four presentations. Thank you very much again for 5 presentations. I'm sorry, I had 4 speakers. Now Zsofia joined us. It's 5 presentations.
Zsofia is again here. Zsofia, somehow. So I don't know what happened, but now you are here, and we really have a couple of minutes. So please just reply the questions. I don't know what happened and why you were not in the group of the discussions, but now you are here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I lost the connection, so I think I was added as not as a participant in the panel. I try to answer the question on the chat to explain a bit how important, I think, in Polish case was the formation of a new young state after more than 100 years break, let's say, on the international area. I think this all things connected with the exclusion of the part of the citizens, and I think it was a part of forming a state in the very, very beginning, because as I mentioned during my short speech, some of the provisions guaranteed minorities obvious rights, but in practice it looks very, very different. I would say that the beginning was in the really reluctance in Polish case, accepting the treaties, and later growing anti-Semitism in the whole Europe had also a great impact on the undertaken activities, but the theories, in my case, were only something added to make a base and to make a propaganda activities. It wasn't the beginning. The beginning was the anti-Semitic and discrimination. So it's maybe different because the Constitution guarantees some rights, but in practice it looks very, very different, especially after 1945, after Piłsudski's death, and it is connected with the change of the whole Polish policy, also the internal policy of the country.
So thank you so much, and thank you again, all of the absolutely inspiring presentations. It was really a kickoff for the next 2 days. Since I know the abstracts of Taras Zara's keynote lecture, I also see some continuation of questions and problematization of borders and the national belonging, ethnicity and racism, and post-imperial territories. So there are many important questions you have already discussed in this first panel. Thank you again. It was really a kind of marathon panel with excellent presentations. And see you soon in 15 minutes with the keynote of Taras Zara. Thank you very much.